Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you again to Evie, not just for that introduction to the both of us, but for being a colleague and leader in the Lewis Center in our department. As I think you all can imagine, many of the people in this room know me pretty well. This is a very proud moment for me because I'm able to share this work that I've been engaged in over a few years with many of the colleagues that are closest to me and some of the students that if I don't know, I will know. So this is a special time and a special opportunity for me to share kind of do my hometown book talk as I'm starting to think of this. And so I wanted to just, again, in this, thought of pride, like show the actual, the published version of this, or the paper version of this. It comes out in a week or so. It's published by the Russell Sage Foundation, and it's been great to work with them as well. So where is the book at? It is here. Here it is. A little bit about, I do want, again, in the maybe getting too prideful, I'm a terrible photographer, but somehow all of these pictures on the cover are mine, and so I'm pretty proud of that as well, ranging from cities from Atlanta to Chicago and D.C. And Los Angeles. So the purpose of the book is to quantitatively summarize the nation's Black neighborhoods over 50 years of the time period. So that's a lot of neighborhoods over a lot of time, and it's hard to really kind of capture, the essence of any one neighborhood through such an inquiry. But I'm hoping to give us a broad survey of what the socioeconomic conditions have been in Black neighborhoods over that time span, and give a flavor of where things are going well, not as well, and how these socioeconomic characteristics are changing over time. Mark mentioned the Fair Housing Act in 1968. That's one of several reasons why starting around 1970 makes some sense if you want to get a holistic picture of Black neighborhoods over the recent decades. Obviously, that's the recent decades are five. I've got 5 recent decades, but there's something particular about 1970 in urban America that's really important. The end of the Great Migration, the increase in immigration from Mexico and Central America and various countries in Asia, the decline of the manufacturing sector. A lot of this stuff has been covered in urban studies research and other macroeconomic research, but these are a bunch of reasons why 1970-ish is important, in addition to Fair Housing Act, housing, the context of housing policy more broadly. So yeah, I think the last piece that I'm of course interested in as a scholar who is situated in a public affairs school is I want to know what public policy can do, has done to influence these outcomes in Black neighborhoods in the United States. I have a particular hook in this book, and it is the evolution of music in Black neighborhood, in the Black community or by Black people more broadly. And I try to use some of the topics that I'm going to explore in a particular chapter by grounding and relating that to the evolution of music in a city or a metropolitan area that exemplifies what that chapter's topic is all about. So some of the themes that I explore as a bit of a hook, to be honest, it is how the Great Migration made Motown possible in Detroit, how concentrated poverty, Black Latino youth culture in the Bronx contributed to the birth of rap, how concentrated disadvantage in the Midwest perhaps limited the reach and the extent of the rap industry in Chicago, and nearby how West Coast rap's violent imagery further diminished the already negative perception of Black neighborhoods. Did a lot of good things too. I don't just dwell on the bad stuff, but that's one aspect of West Coast rap. And then in the 21st century context, how Atlanta's dominance of 21st century rap and arguably the music industry is an indicator of the South's growing economic and cultural import, particularly in the Black community. So, related to this, what does DMX have to do with fair housing? If you're a DMX fan, you might be aware of where the title of my book comes from, Where the Hood At is a song, or was a song produced by DMX, otherwise known as Earl Simmons. A quick disclaimer that I think is important is if you are really familiar with DMX's work and Where the Hood At in particular, this is one of the most misogynistic, homophobic texts you are going to read in rap lyrics. So I want to make sure that you all know that I don't condone that, but there are a few reasons why I think the book's title works. Where the Hood At? Where is it? Where are we at socioeconomically? These sorts of double entendres are great for a dad like me who loves dad jokes and came up with a title one day. It also happens that DMX is a pretty perfect human incarnate of this trajectory of 50 years of Black neighborhoods. He was born in 1970 in Mount Vernon, New York. He grew up in public housing in Yonkers. This is the site of the most sustained opposition to public housing dispersal and integration in the country. Happened virtually throughout his lifetime. When Earl was 10 years old, the federal government sued the Yonkers Board of Education, the City of Yonkers, and Yonkers Community Development Agency for intentionally segregating public housing in Southwest Yonkers, where DMX or Earl Simmons grew up. DMX as a rap artist is inarguably extremely successful and important. He released 5 albums between 1998 and 2003, all that debuted #1 on not the rap charts or the R&B charts, but the charts. So there was no question that around 2000 he was the biggest rap star in the world, soon to be eclipsed perhaps by Eminem, and arguably one of the biggest musical acts on the planet. Fair housing in Yonkers was and is a very, very prominent case study in the field. So there are very few urban planning documentaries out there that you really want to view. Well, I would disagree with wanting to view. I want to view urban planning documentaries, but very few of them become miniseries on HBO. So the story of fair housing in Yonkers, at least the popular version of this, popularized version of this, is that Mayor Nick Wasisco is elected in 1987 on a wave of opposition to desegregation. As I noted, was a very contentious battle between the federal government and various government agencies in Westchester County, including Yonkers. The federal court mandated a desegregation plan. There was a judge that monitored this desegregation plan's progress. Mayor Wasisco reluctantly felt as though he had to kind of lead on this. He was defeated then in a backlash election and died by suicide at the young age of 34. And this is Oscar Isaac, who played Mayor Wasisco in the HBO miniseries Show Me a Hero, which is based on Lisa Belkin's book of the same title. In 2021, so very recently, after a very long fight over desegregation in Westchester County and Yonkers in particular, a federal monitor finally rules in favor of Westchester County, saying, okay, you've done enough to further fair housing in your jurisdiction, which probably ends the role of the federal government in tight oversight of fair housing in Westchester County. And it so happens that April Earl Simmons died of a cocaine-induced heart attack at the age of 50. So his life trajectory is undoubtedly, I think, emblematic of the promise and perils of growing up in Black neighborhoods, and of course neatly fits over this chronology that I'm interested in exploring and sharing with you. So some of my motivations in studying this topic and writing this book, we can look at DMX's Yonkers neighborhood as a very poor yet rather racially diverse place, majority Latino during many of the recent decades, and currently it's probably not a typical Black neighborhood, but what is? I want to kind of capture that. There's a persistence of gaps, of course, and disparities between Black households, individuals, in terms of income, wealth, unemployment, education, health outcomes, etc. We think these are related to spatial disparities, so I'm furthering my investigation into the role of neighborhood in those disparities. I argue that the forces that lead to concentrated disadvantage in Black neighborhoods are not entirely the same as those that lead to those disparities, though, and I think it's important to look at these neighborhood disparities on their own. And I think that one thing that is fairly tangible in that is that the continued devaluation of Black neighborhoods is a related but distinct process from our devaluation of Black life or the acceptance that we may have as a society in the furthering disparities at these individual level. As Mark, I think, maybe not so generously pointed out, also, nobody's done this before. And I had an idea and I ran with it. That's not a great reason if you're thinking of, embarking on a scholarly work. That's not the only thing you should consider, but if you're the first to do something, we tend to look fondly on that. Okay, let's get some data. The first thing that I need to do before I start throwing out all the data I can think of that would interest you is to set some ground rules on definitions. So I study 172 metropolitan areas using U.S. Census data from 1970 to the 2015-19 American Community Survey. I define a Black neighborhood as a census tract in which Black people constitute a plurality, not a majority. They are the largest racial or ethnic group. And boy, is 4 racial or ethnic groups woefully inadequate to capture racial and ethnic diversity. A few conversations have been had about that very recently. And so I understand that, like, lumping Blacks and whites and Asians and Hispanics together as our 4 major groups is problematic, but that's the best we can do with these data. Thinking about whether it matters in terms of plurality or majority, the vast, vast majority of our Black neighborhoods where Black people are the largest racial or ethnic group are also the neighborhoods where Black people are a majority. So it largely doesn't matter, and that's how segregation often works in this country. Although those things are tied together less so now than they used to be. We now have more neighborhoods that are a Black plurality and not Black majority, and that's important to note. 98% in 1970 versus 80% in 2017. If you have to leave early, here's what I find. There's a lot of regional concentration and variation across regions. If you just look at the 4 regions of the country as defined by the U.S. Census, the West, the Northeast and West, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the South. There's a lot of socioeconomic strength in Black neighborhoods in the South and the West, much less so in the Midwest and the Northeast. There's some variation within, but not that much. The good news in the West is countered by the bad news that Black neighborhoods are disappearing in the West. Anybody who's been to South LA on and off over the last 20 years knows that story. There's a limited convergence, a sliver of good news. but only a sliver when we compare black and non-black neighborhood outcomes over time. We have a limited convergence in socioeconomic characteristics between those two places. Black neighborhoods are heterogeneous, but socioeconomically less heterogeneous than non-black neighborhoods. You know, when you select on something like neighborhood race, you get those types of outcomes, especially when you're talking about Black America. Success stories these days are more successful. Through 1990, the most affluent Black neighborhoods were similar to lower class non-Black neighborhoods. Now, the ceiling is a middle class non-Black neighborhood, where a properly Black middle class neighborhood exists now. It is very hard. The final thing is that it is very hard to have successful Black neighborhoods without strong metropolitan economies. Some additional arguments I make in the book. Black people routinely report that they want to live in integrated but Black neighborhoods. So if you're thinking about what are the ideal locational outcomes for Black people, much of what they profess is a desire to live amongst their own to a certain extent. Second piece is flourishing Black neighborhoods are concentrated in the South and West metropolitan areas. Housing costs here are rising in these places, but gentrification is rarely, not never, the main problem. Neighborhood-based investments are rarely effective. I think we need to broaden our scope to a regional focus in more of our policy making. Inclusive development can yield some dividends, particularly in suburban locations that tend to be more affluent. One simple piece of that is building more housing in the suburbs and higher income places. Another aspect of that is finding ways to counteract the problem of low home ownership rates in Black neighborhoods and increasing things like shared equity, community land trusts, things like that. And finally, not surprisingly, I would say reducing neighborhood disparities will inevitably entail reducing our levels of individual disparities. Okay, seriously. Data. I know you came here for lots of tables and figures. I've got lots of tables and figures. I've pared them down over the years, but you know, you still are going to look at table 3.12. There's a lot of them. Okay. Again, regional concentration, here's what that looks like. Black neighborhoods are highly concentrated in particular metros. In particular, that's Chicago, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, D.C., and Detroit. Those 6 metropolitan areas used to account for 45% of all relevant, all Black neighborhoods. That's now down to, let me move Mike's face. 36%. Woo! All right, everybody like that. All right. Now, if you add Atlanta and drop Los Angeles, because there are many more Black neighborhoods in Atlanta now, and many fewer in Los Angeles, they've kind of gone like this. This will get you back to 41% of the nation's total in just 6 metropolitan areas. That piece makes it easier to summarize some of the nation's Black neighborhood conditions because they are very concentrated in particular places. One thing that I argue throughout the book is that the scholarly focus on Black individual outcomes, Black neighborhood outcomes, segregation, et cetera, has been heavily weighted towards northern, Midwestern, Northeastern metropolitan areas, Chicago, New York, a little bit of Los Angeles, and we ignore the South at our peril. This is most obvious in places like Atlanta, and if you argue that Washington, D.C. is southern-ish, but there's a vast overrepresentation of Black neighborhoods in the South that we tend to ignore in our study of Black spaces and geographies. See, you know, I just keep getting in the way. Doesn't matter what I do. Anywho, some Top line findings. In 1970 and 1980, the average black neighborhood was 3 times as impoverished as the average non-black neighborhood. By 2010, that ratio was 2 to 1, and that's holding. So if you want to take away your happy good news, there's at least a glass half full perspective here that things have gotten a lot better. Some of that is due to rising poverty rates outside of black neighborhoods. A lot of that is due to, where are we? Decline, steady but mild declines from 27 to 28% in black neighborhoods in 1970-80 to 23% most recently. So the declines are, that declining ratio is on both sides of the coin. Black and non-black neighborhoods are becoming more racially diverse. The share of whites in black neighborhoods is kind of a U shape, but not like a very deep U. 18% in 1970, down to 14% in 1980, and back up to 17% in 2017. This is part of a trajectory where there is more racial diversity of all kinds in black neighborhoods, also outside of black neighborhoods. Amidst, though, a decline, the context here, though, is a declining share of white people in metropolitan area totally, right? So outside of black neighborhoods, the white share goes down from 94% to 62%. So you could tell yourself a story of like, oh, well, white people seem to be far more interested in locating in black neighborhoods / less, discriminatory against black neighborhoods. That's a story I think that holds some water here. Of course, Hispanics and Latinos, and to a lesser extent, Asian Americans have become more numerous inside and outside of black neighborhoods to different degrees. This is just looking at that kind of graphically, and really captures this difference in the likelihood that a white individual is going to locate in a black neighborhood over time. So this is the ratio between non-black to black neighborhoods, and whites are far less likely to be outside of non-black neighborhoods, still 3.5 times as likely as being in black neighborhoods, but that decline is fairly pronounced. Asian and Pacific Islander and Hispanic people are equally likely to locate inside and outside of non-black neighborhoods over time, and Hispanic individuals are pretty much on par regardless of what the type of neighborhood is. Those of you that know me in my other capacities as a researcher know that I like to talk about housing sometimes. As one of the bona fide UCLA density bros, what up, Shane? I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how we don't build housing anywhere anymore. That is it. So the percent of units built more than 30 years ago in black neighborhoods has gone up substantially. There's the percent of housing units that have built more than 30 years ago in non-black neighborhoods has gone up a lot. The percent of housing built recently in both neighborhoods has gone down, less so in black neighborhoods. This is important not just because I'm a density bro, but Karen Chappell named us this. It's not us. This is not just because I like housing density. It's because the history of housing discrimination and black outcomes is tied in part to the age of the housing stock in black, inside and outside of black neighborhoods. Traditionally, black people were, kind of shunted into the most aged areas of metropolitan United States. And of course, as we suburbanized, we built a bunch of new housing that only white people could occupy. This trend is not necessarily reversing entirely, but you're seeing the age of the housing stock in white America, so non-black America versus black America, starting to converge a little bit. And that has implications for, I think, how people for the relative valuation or demand people are going to have for living in black neighborhoods versus outside of black neighborhoods. Now, that could raise some other challenges in Black neighborhoods, right? Where if people start demanding living in those places a lot, that can bring challenges of gentrification and displacement. But if your main problem is a lack of demand, which has been a traditional problem, of course, in Black parts of the US, this could be a good thing. I also want to give a disclaimer that I've got some janky, figures here. This is my maiden voyage on this book talk. You're the first audience. Congratulations, or I'm sorry. I don't even have a clean digital copy of this thing, so I'm using, the author's proofs, and I'm sorry. It doesn't look as beautiful as it could, but we're all friends here. Okay. As a result, perhaps, of not building much housing, rents are rising everywhere. These rents are all in 2021 dollars, and these rents are rising equally in Black and non-Black neighborhoods. Of course, there's a gap between those neighborhoods. There's a long literature that suggests that this gap is not as large as you might think, given the relative disadvantage of those two types of neighborhoods. And that tells us that that's one reason why we have very high rent burdens in relatively disadvantaged places, and these rent burdens are getting, of course, worse and worse in both Black and non-Black neighborhoods. Home values are also rising over this time period, in constant dollars, but you see that particularly coming out of the Great Recession, Black neighborhood housing values have not rebounded they've not rebounded totally, and are rebounding slowly in general. So I've addressed some of this in the regional story, but where else are Black neighborhoods thriving and or struggling? Black neighborhoods are least disadvantaged in the West. So these are looking at poverty rates. In the grayish are Black neighborhoods. In red is non-Black neighborhoods. So you see a pretty similar set of poverty rates across space in non-Black neighborhoods, but in Black neighborhoods, those rates are much higher in the Midwest, much lower in the West. But Black neighborhoods are disappearing in the West. So steady growth in the South, pretty much flat in the Midwest and Northeast, and a huge decline off of a pretty low share anyway in the West. So we are down to about 2% of the West census tracts actually being Black neighborhoods. Again, if you've lived in Los Angeles for a while, if you've lived in the Bay Area for a while, this is not news to you. It's important to note that you might be thinking, well, the Midwest and the Northeast, these are economically challenged places that have been left behind, particularly the aging Northeast metros that go along the Great Lakes. This is not just a story of absolute disadvantage in these metropolitan areas, but relative disadvantage in a lot of cases in these metropolitan areas. Take Peoria. I know everybody's been thinking about Peoria this week. In the Peoria, Illinois metro in 2017, there were 10 Black census tracts. The unemployment rate in those neighborhoods ranged from 12% to almost a third, 31%. Compare that to Nashville. The Black neighborhood unemployment rate is 6%, half as high. Peoria's non-Black census tract poverty rate is 10%, 3 or 4 points below the national average. In its Black census tracts is 41%. Now, I'm cherry picking the most obviously, disparate numbers, or metro with the most disparate numbers, but you see this pattern throughout the Midwest and the aging Northeast. It's not, living in the Detroit metropolitan area does not mean you are likely to be in a disadvantaged neighborhood. There's lots of wealth in the Detroit metropolitan area. In Black neighborhoods in Detroit, it's a very different story. even somewhere as affluent as where I'm from, the Minneapolis, St. Paul metropolitan area. That has one of the highest ratios between Black neighborhood poverty rates and white neighborhood poverty rates that you're going to find. So even in places that are not what we would think as Rust Belt, the Midwest is particularly unequal. I wanted to just list some of the places where things are going the best. Washington D.C. and Atlanta, I talk a lot about in the book. And so those are places where we have relatively low poverty rates. This list ranges from 14 to 19%. So the good news is we have places with relatively low Black neighborhood poverty rates, but these Black neighborhood poverty rates are, of course, equal or greater than the national average. So it's only to a certain extent that affluence is kind of the norm in a metropolitan area's Black neighborhoods. I spent an entire chapter on Atlanta and Washington, D.C. And one of the reasons is the two main things that stand out about Atlanta and Washington, D.C. is not just the low poverty rates. There's also, for Atlanta, in red here, a very meaningful decline over time in poverty rates, very substantial as well in D.C., but to a slightly lesser extent because their baseline was lower. The other thing is these are two of the places with the most Black neighborhoods in all of the country. Atlanta and DC offer a unique combination of a very extensive set of Black neighborhoods, places where Black people do live, and also a very low level of disadvantage. The counter happiness story in DC are the skyrocketing home prices. So if you look at Black neighborhoods in DC, we have a almost doubling in the average neighborhood median home price in DC. And we know, just as if you've been in Los Angeles for a while, you may know about racial transition in our Black neighborhoods. In DC, you have the other kind of most glaring case of racial transition in Black neighborhoods. But even within Black neighborhoods, that are still Black, we have massive increases in home prices in DC. Because I have such a large set of neighborhoods and I have variation over time I can look at, I'm able to run some regression analyses to try to figure out what are some of the strongest associations of a metropolitan area and local conditions and Black neighborhood poverty outcomes. I won't get into the details of the data and the models, but a few things to take away. The average family income in a metro always has a significant improvement in the poverty conditions in Black neighborhoods. So metropolitan economies really matter. Metropolitan level socioeconomic conditions really matter. The South used to have a higher Black neighborhood poverty rate than the Midwest, controlling for various metropolitan conditions, and now has a lower poverty rate. So it wasn't always the case that the South was like a good place to be living in a Black neighborhood. Now that has changed. Segregation persistently relates to higher Black poverty rates. So the fact that we focus on segregation is nice and good and important. But it's not one of the most meaningful things once you add some of the other socioeconomic characteristics of Black neighborhoods. In other words, segregation has a meaningful but limited effect on Black neighborhood poverty. Over half of the variation in Black neighborhood poverty is basically explained by the size of a regional economy and how people are economically sorted across space. Oh, okay, this is going to get better in a couple clicks. Okay, so I spent a whole chapter on gentrification, and I think what are some nuanced findings? Come with me. In the kind of positive trends and this limited convergence between black and non-black neighborhoods, what's the overarching thing going on? Is it a growing black middle class, or is this something that we might think of as gentrification? Our little friend says, why not both? And then I want to highlight, which came a little too early for the punchline, that we don't really have much of either, right? The typical case is not either a gentrifying black neighborhood or a black middle class neighborhood. So that's important to remember. So to think of gentrification as a growing problem, or to kind of anticipate gentrification as a growing problem in black neighborhoods, we would have to have a story that there's rising demand for living in black neighborhoods. And we have some fundamentals there that point in that direction. We have higher income households seemingly increasingly opting for central city locations or staying there for a little bit longer in their lives. I talked about the age gap between black and non-black neighborhoods. So as the housing stock kind of converges in age, we might see people kind of valuing black and non-black neighborhoods in a different way. But the overwhelming typical condition, again, is disadvantage or a lack of demand and investment. So and the other piece of this is that as much as we talk about a back to the city movement, suburban population growth is much more robust than central city population growth. We do have a slowly growing number of black middle class neighborhoods, but demand appears to be growing faster. Here's the data I used to make that claim. 10% of black neighborhoods are in the top quartile of home values, up from 4% in 1980, but in terms of income, the top income quartile for black neighborhoods, there's only been a movement from 3 to 4%. So that's a very slow growth in any sort of indicator of black middle class neighborhoods, and up from 1.5% to 5%. So that's a little bit better of an indicator of like, okay, we have some more black neighborhoods that are very low poverty, right? But in terms of income growth, very, very small. In terms of house price growth, quite a bit more rapid. And these are all within the metropolitan areas distribution for quartiles. As far as the connection between racial transition and gentrification, there's mild evidence that black neighborhoods are racially transitioning more quickly now in like the last 20 years than in the previous 30 years. I also find that gentrification rates are slowly rising in black neighborhoods relative to the previous 30 years. And there is some convergence between these things, of course, that some of the black neighborhoods that are becoming something else racially are also the ones that are gentrifying. And we see that in part because median rents, home values, and incomes are all higher when neighborhoods are racially transitioning from black neighborhoods to something else. Here's how I kind of think about the prevalence of gentrification in black neighborhoods. We've got 3 different types of neighborhoods. The black and white, the zebras are the black neighborhoods, Hispanic neighborhoods are in red, and high poverty neighborhoods are the dots. So you see that over time, there's a little bit of a fluctuation, but a pretty meaningful rise from 2000 to 2010 from 4 to 11% of black neighborhoods gentrify, stays relatively steady in the next decade. We see these sorts of increases in high poverty neighborhoods as well, and the baseline is higher in high poverty neighborhoods. Hispanic and black neighborhoods are fairly equally likely to gentrify over this time period, and they're both seeing gentrification as a little bit more of a prevalent outcome than they did in the prior decades. Again, like everything else, this is a regional story. Gentrification rates in Western black neighborhoods are 17%. That's a lot higher than everywhere else. In the Bay Area, that's 25% in the last decade. In Nashville, that's 23%. New Orleans, 17%. And then in terms of places with a lot of black neighborhoods like Atlanta, New York, and D.C., that's 12%. So that varies quite a lot. And these are like these are much, much higher numbers than everywhere else, which is in the low single digits or below. So again, I'm a policy person. I'll conclude with talking a little bit about how we, hopefully accelerate some of this convergence. I have 4 key findings I want to review. We have slow improvement in Black neighborhoods, which tracks a slow improvement in these disparities, or reduction in these disparities at the individual level. Metropolitan level differences and regional differences are quite vast. Metro level characteristics are very important. Strong regional economies, southern economies, places with a large Black population, places with a long history of Black enfranchisement and economic entrepreneurship, like DC and Atlanta, are in much better places. And I think that gentrification concerns are overheated, but not everywhere. Particularly Los Angeles and DC. Those are conversations that are absolutely valid. What's been tried before? We make a lot of efforts to try to move people out of disadvantaged neighborhoods. Those have had limited but important effects. Efforts to invest in neighborhoods through housing policy or economic development have been piecemeal and rarely sustained. The evidence base is pretty small. Community development evidence is also pretty limited. It's probably the case that the wave of community organizing around public safety in particular played a role in the crime decline since the 1990s. So there are some really important wins. But at the end of the day, the US lacks a durable urban policy where we make sustained investments in a systematic way over time. So I make a suggestion that we focus on 3 pillars of policy. We focus regionally, we focus on inclusive development, and we invest in people directly. The regional focus is shifting our attention from simply the neighborhood level of either investment or mobility in and out to a regional or metropolitan level where people have a chance to make both larger levels of changes through investment or bigger changes if they're residentially mobile. So we do a lot of work incentivizing people to move from different neighborhoods, when in some metropolitan areas, if you wanted to live in another Black neighborhood, you would also be moving to disadvantaged neighborhoods. And the only way to move to a Black neighborhood would be to actually leave the metropolitan area altogether. Obviously, it's a lot harder, and there's got to be a lot more things going on in life to move your metropolitan area or to move your region. But some of these mobility conversations need to include those options that are a lot more likely to engage in more integrative moves. The South is where it's at. Where's my blue? Blue's dead. Okay. So I'm not the first person to talk about not both the accelerated movement of Black people to the South and also the interests that we could have in accelerating that movement as ways to give people better options in their living environments. I'm a Midwesterner, so I don't want everybody to leave the Midwest. There are some things we could do to enhance the economic prospects of the Midwest. We can move parts of the federal government to the Midwest or aging metros in the Northeast. We could invest on a broader scale in universities and college campuses. I think, most people in this room probably think that universities do some good. And immigration, like, who the hell knows on the future of immigration, but things like heartland visas that incentivize immigrants to move to places in which they are they have been less likely to move, and in particular places that have been left behind economically can help turn their fortunes around. Inclusive development, I touched on this already. To me, it starts with pushing more to integrate the suburbs, build more housing in places that are traditionally exclusive. That would help, I think, prevent displacement in Black neighborhoods, because you are accommodating a lot of the demand that is not being accommodated outside of Black neighborhoods. And then there are inclusive development models that might assist with the big kind of homeownership disparities that we have in and outside of Black neighborhoods. People who live in Black neighborhoods are far less likely to own their own homes. So when demand rises in those neighborhoods, they're much more likely to be priced out. And so community land trusts and other shared equity models can be something that would help people stay in their homes or find more sustainable, longer term locations in those places. And then we've got pilots in the country that help renters build equity. And in those places, again, where demand is rising, renters can be protected from being priced out if they've built equity through renter wealth funds and the like. I'll speed through this, but again, I think it's impossible to close these neighborhood level gaps without closing some of the individual level gaps. And there are a lot of ways that we could further invest in not just Black people, but other lower income families. And I want to leave you with a thought experiment. So if you're a community organizer and you've been toiling away for years in Crenshaw or the Shaw DC, the Shaw U Street neighborhood in DC, and you get in some time machine, my point of reference is Back to the Future. Younger people probably have various Marvel movies in mind. You get in some time machine and you move to 2024. You're going to encounter an entirely different racial diversity in that neighborhood. You're going to encounter an entirely different built environment that suggests, on the good side, heretofore unprecedented investment in these neighborhoods. What would those organizers, those time travelers, think about racial progress in those communities? What should they think? And I think, what your answer is to those questions gets to so many of the most fundamental conversations and debates that we have in urban policy. And I don't have the answer. That's why I put it all in question marks. I do know that the stakes are high. To leave you with one hip hop reference. That's me. That's what I do. Thank you. From where you're sitting, you can just click on that link right there and you can get one of these via pre-order. All right. I'm going to sit down and stop talking. What you got for me, brother?
Good stuff.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm just going to ask one question, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A for questions from the audience. Is that cool? Yep. So first question, Mike.
Yes.
Kind of a not two-parter, but in two different ways of saying. So what findings surprised you? And I think maybe this is getting into my own psyche, or maybe another way of saying it is, what findings did you resist? if you ever resist believing.
Oh, that's a really cool way of putting it. I mean, I think what surprised me early and often throughout this inquiry, and this goes back to, I want to first, before I really answer that question, I know I didn't really give some love to the people that helped me work on this. So Greg Preston in particular, as a doctoral student, was instrumental in a lot of the data work and the conversations I had. I mean, I had a very early conversation with you, Hillary Malson. I can't name all the people that that I worked that really helped me with those conversations, and just the work. But to get to your question, early and often, the surprising thing for me was the Southern story. Where, and I do think this is a big hole in segregation research, in neighborhood effects research, in urban policy research more broadly, is most of us don't live in the South. Most of us didn't grow up in the South. And a lot of the main models for how we understand concentrated disadvantage come out of Chicago, they come out of New York, they come out of Los Angeles, they come out of ethnographies in northern and western urban America. And it's just something that didn't really occur to me, that you would find a lot of relatively advantaged Black neighborhoods in Dallas, and you would find them in Houston, and you would find them in Raleigh, and Charlotte, and of course Atlanta and D.C. There's flickers of conversations that are more advanced there, so that was a little less surprising to me. But like the widespread relatively good news out of the South, and the trajectory has been going like this out of the South. That's without question, I think, what has continually surprised me the most. I think, you asked about what I've resisted. I think, I think you might hear, I think some people in the audience might hear more kind of a reflexive gentrification skepticism out of me that comes out sometimes, where and part of this is I came of age, studying urban America when we were still kind of focused on the 90s and how bad things were in most places. And then I think, I come to teach a lot of students who have lived in the last decade or grew up in, East LA or South LA, and they're like, that's, the main problem that we're all talking about is how we're getting priced out of this place. And it's taken me a while to kind of reorient myself to thinking about that. And then I look at, what's typical, because I'm a quantitative researcher. I look at like the average, example. It's like, well, most Black neighborhoods are still like getting more disadvantaged, and very few of them are gentrifying. But then again, like you look at some cities and it's extraordinary. Like the Bay Area having a already shrunken number of Black neighborhoods over looking at the last decade. So you're looking at a dwindling baseline, and a quarter of them gentrified in 7 years. That's a lot, and so I bet that is one of the things that took me the longest to really be like, yeah, maybe you should give this a little bit more attention than you think.
I'm going to cheat. I'm going to ask another question. The way a very important historical framing for the Black experience in the United States has been from slavery to freedom. And migration has played such an important, but at least the way that I feel, a disappointing kind of prospect. So we have the first great migration, or not first great, but the other first migration from the old South to the new South. And then we can think about that as kind of like Arkansas. And then World War I, we have the Great Migration, or the long Great Migration that begins World War I and continues past World War II. And I kind of thought about places like Los Angeles as a failed promised land. And so I'm thinking about the South as a potential return. Are we on the cusp of a third Great Migration? And what are your insights about the possibility of Black Americans finally having a home, right?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question. I think we are in the midst of a migration. I wouldn't call it a great one necessarily, just due to its on the Black side. There's two things that I think, you know, bring it down a notch from the great migrations of the past. You know, one is just its sheer volume. The other is like, this is part of a American Sunbelt migration, you know, that Blacks are a little bit late to in some ways, but I think, but like, they're not the only ones, you know, engaged in this kind of massive population movement. I do think it, you know, I do think it holds a lot of promise. But like, do I think this is likely to be a solution in the way that we would think, that in the way that we will conclude that it's a promised land? That seems unlikely. In some ways, I'm underqualified to really answer that, because I don't know the South as well as I know some of the rest of the country. But I think we need more study, and I think we could even do some policy around it. I think we could. There's a lot of, you know, one thing I talk about in the book is there's a lot of Southern Black mayors of like mid-size and even relatively major cities. Like, could they develop some programs that would disproportionately benefit in movers to those cities that are Black and want to start a business, so they want to buy their first home, that are disproportionately cheaper than they are in these traditional expensive metros. So, you know, I think there's promise and there's a migration. I just don't know if it's a great migration to the promised land, you know?
All right, let's thank you. Let's open it up for questions. So ground rules, questions are actually questions, comments are short. Let's go ahead.
Hey, well, thank you, Mike, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Your book will become a classic. We can all say that we were at the first presentation. So,
Woo!
having said that, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about home ownership? We know it's down in general, but relatively speaking, how does home ownership rates compare, and how they have changed in Black neighborhoods? And I think you made the comment and you explained why gentrification is one reason, but not the most important reason that we see. But there is also housing, lack of housing affordability. And I would suspect that because most people are renters, this affects, I mean, this is an even larger issue in many Black neighborhoods. Anyway, the question is about home ownership rates and relative decline compared to others.
Yeah, I mean, as I don't have these figures, you know, perfectly memorized off the top of my head, but my pretty decent recollection is that home ownership rates are pretty steady in Black neighborhoods over this time period. I think in the high 40%, compared to the high 60% in non-Black neighborhoods. And that kind of mirrors like Black individual or household homeownership rates versus non-Black differentials. So there's a big, you know, in most years, there's a 25 to 30% gap in home ownership rates between Black and non-Black neighborhoods. Again, that hasn't really fluctuated a great amount over recent decades. But, you know, what that always forces us to confront is that as much as we are concerned about concentrated disadvantage and underinvestment in Black communities, we always have to be attentive to what accelerated investment, accelerated you know, cost of living would do to people who don't own their own homes. And that's going to be the majority in most cases.
Right in the back.
I'm from Detroit, and one of the things that historically has happened within the city has been you have one of the most affluent cities in the country, and you have white flight.
Yeah.
And then you start to have black flight because so many people left the city that the tax base it couldn't afford to support the land that it had.
Yep.
So now you're seeing a regeneration of the city, but that's where it seems like gentrification is coming into play.
Yeah.
Is that only the areas in which are non-black neighborhoods are the first ones to be regenerated.
Mhm.
So, in your opinion, from your research, how has the history of white flight moving towards suburban areas impacted these black communities? And then going from those black communities, how can they rebuild if there's not enough people in those communities to really rebuild them without gentrification?
Yeah, I mean, the first question is straight. That my response to your first question is it's clear that you don't have this concentrated disadvantage in black neighborhoods, particularly in the late 20th century, without a lot of things. But one of those things is the fact that white people left those neighborhoods behind. And so that white flight process is absolutely central to part and parcel in the devaluation of black neighborhoods and black spaces. And so I don't think you have anything like that level of concentrated disadvantage without white flight. And then the next step in the process in some ways is, with some aspects of fair housing making some aspects of black movement to more integrated places more possible, then you have an even deeper decline in the kind of average fortunes of black neighborhoods. Then, part of that, of course, is, results in population loss and vacancy. Of course, to some extent, parts of Detroit, signify some of the most extreme kind of vacancy and population loss challenges that, major cities like that had, but certainly not the only. Then the question is, what the heck can be done, has been done in an effective way? I think, one aspect I think is tying the fortunes of central city and suburban America together, right? If you had revenue sharing between, this, very wealthy suburban Detroit and Detroit, you would have a lot better, at least social service outcomes, public service outcomes. I think, I talked about heartland visas as a way to attract population. So, if you look at, one thing that I think South Los Angeles signifies is like the power that robust immigration can have in stabilizing the population base of a disadvantaged neighborhood, right? So if Detroit had the kind of immigration that like Chicago or anything like what Los Angeles had, you wouldn't have that kind of population loss challenge as much. But now, but like then, solutions beyond that are really, really hard. And I think, the last thing I would say is I talked about the absence of, durable urban investments. This our federal government framework, our state and local government revenue base just doesn't offer a lot of kind of sustained investments, both either in a set of neighborhoods over decades, or it doesn't we don't really have a framework for investing in regions in the way that you could, potentially turn around more of the Midwest. Not all of it, but like more of it than we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Maybe time for one more or two if folks want to stay a little longer. Go ahead, Brian.
Great talk.
Thanks, Brian.
It's going to be a super book. I had just one preliminary question that I might have missed. But I think we may have touched on it, and then a thing about the South that I just wanted to mention. One was, what is the share of the Black population that lives in plurality Black neighborhoods? And how has that changed over time? So that's just the preliminary one.
Yeah.
And then I'll give you the about the South. I think two things. And I remember looking at data about the share of urbanized area populations that's Black, and it varies enormously across the country and is extremely high in the South. So one thing is, in terms of trying to predict prospering in the South now, is the fact that just the share of the population that's Black is much higher. You see that having an effect on what you're describing as a sort of renaissance. And the second thing is, I saw data that might even come out of the Housing Bureau's work, is that the ratio of population growth and housing production in the South has been very tight, where they've been out of sync in many other parts of the country.
Right.
Does that, I think, have some role as well in sort of this renaissance in the South?
Yeah, I mean, going in reverse, maybe like the South, is a much more affordable environment, even controlling for regional economies, and income, and some of that has to, I think, as a density bro, has to have something to do with the fact that it is easier to build in a lot of the cities and metros in the South, and they do tend to respond to population growth and economic growth with allowing more housing to be built. Before that, you were talking about the share. So one of one of the things I sped through, of course, was trying to summarize and make sense of some of the regression models that I ran, and the share African American in a metropolitan area is correlated with lower poverty rates in Black neighborhoods, which that actually surprised me. Part of that is like this Southern story, where the South has better indicators and it has a higher share of Black people in its metropolitan areas. But there's something, even after controlling for a bunch of things, that says, a more Black metro has better outcomes in its Black neighborhoods. I don't have a perfect explanation for that, but it suggests that, if there is this continued kind of movement of Black people to the South, and that raises the share of Black people in those metros, that could have positive benefits for Black neighborhoods. And then you asked about the share of the nation's Black people that live in Black neighborhoods. I don't have that off the top of my head. I know that Black neighborhoods have gone from something like 81% Black on average to 66% Black on average. That is mostly accounted for by increasing numbers of Latinos and Hispanics and Asians. Again, the share white is mostly flat. Then the question, but like, how does that? I'm quite certain that Black people are less likely to live in Black neighborhoods than they used to be, but how big of a change that is, I don't have off the top of my head.
Maybe one more that we had. Did we end at 45 or?
We end up 45.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we cut it?
I'll be here all day.
We should
cut it.
Thank you.